The French Revolution was neither French nor a revolution. Discuss.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Chris Pourteau and David Bruns. Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. You can find all of the archives of the show at hankgarner.com. And when you're there, click on the subscribe buttons in the right-hand sidebar. There's places where you can subscribe in iTunes and Google Play and Stitcher Radio and even YouTube, hankgarner.com. I'd like to thank some sponsors that make this show possible. Grammarly. Go to getgrammarly.com/Hank to sign up for your free account. Grammarly, built by linguists and language lovers, Grammarly's writing app finds and corrects hundreds of complex writing errors, so you don't have to. Grammarly corrects hundreds of grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes while also catching contextual errors, improving your vocabulary, and suggesting style improvements. Go to getgrammarly.com/Hank when you're working on that new book before you send it to your final editor. Let Grammarly take a pass at it. You'd be surprised at what it'll catch, and your editor will thank you for it. Brand new from Stefan Bolt's The White Dragon Omnibus Edition. This book has been 2 years in the making for those of us that have been following along as Stefan has released the books Genesis, Crucible, and Alchemy. We have been on the edge of our seats waiting to see how he would finish the series, and now you can read it all in one volume. No waiting. Genesis, Crucible, and Alchemy, The White Dragon series by Stefan Boltz. Available now. There's links to it in the show notes. Untold Deception by William Stakos. I looked up. The executioner pulled the lever. Her body fell, and the crowd cheered. I couldn't watch the rest, so I lowered my eyes to the ground. I think I understand now. I get it, Mom. I now know what it means to grow up. Untold Deception by William Stakos is a book full of magic, coming-of-age story, and a story about family. Check out the link in the show notes, Untold Deception by William Stakos. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip for Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have two great friends of mine on the show, Chris Pourteau and David Bruns. Both join me for a really unique project that they have been working on furiously and secretively in the background. Chris, Chris and I have a long, sordid history, and I'll let you fill in those blanks as you will. But Chris has been working on something connected to this for quite a while, and we had lots of great conversations. And then last year, he told me that he and David were working on a project kind of connected to that. And I have been completely in the dark about this until just a few days ago. Not completely, but so I, like you, dear listeners, are in for a treat today to hear all about the SynCorp Saga. And also David Bruns joins us. You know David from the Two Navy Guys series that he and J.R. help me out, David. J.R.
Olson.
Yes, thanks. Wrote those phenomenal modern day thrillers with political military thrillers that I absolutely love so much. And David's also been on to talk about his science fiction. So today we've got these two guys with clear bona fides to talk about science fiction and this new series. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you very much, Hank.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah,
I love getting to hang out with you guys. It's been a while for both of you, so
it has.
Yeah,
yes.
So we've been needing to do this. So first off, Chris and David, tell us what you've been working on in the background. Whoever wants to go first, and kind of bring us up to speed on what you've been doing and how this joint project came to be.
Do you want to start, Chris?
Sure, I can. So we've been working the last year on a project that sort of tells the near future history of an Earth suffering from climate change issues, climate crisis, actually. And so David has taken the lead on the first 3 books in this new series that we're writing. So I'm going to sort of let him tell about what he's created in those 3 books.
Sure. So Chris has been kicking this idea around for a couple of years. We've been talking off and on about it, and we finally decided. Actually, it's almost a year ago exactly. I think it was it was just after Labor Day last year when I started.
We've almost gotten our first anniversary. Yay.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess it's a paper anniversary. How appropriate?
How appropriate is that? Exactly.
So the idea was, and Chris had actually written a novel called ORP, Optional Retirement Plan. It was a very sort of tongue-in-cheek Raymond Chandler meets Robert Heinlein kind of thing. That was really interesting, and he started telling me about this whole world that he wanted to build out, which is sort of a cross between corporate intrigue. I think the tagline we'd like to throw around is it's The Godfather meets The Expanse. And so and he started talking about he wanted to have a big long story arc, a 9-book story arc, and with 3 different entry points, 3 different standalone trilogies within this larger universe. And Chris had a really solid vision and picture in his head for how he wanted the center trilogy to start. So I said, well, I'll take the lead on writing the sort of the prequel trilogy, which is I would describe it as a near future being sort of the end of this current century, possibly beginning of the next one, where we see some technological advances, but we also see a very damaging climate change type of environment, and the world governments decide that they're going to try to use a private sector approach to things, and surprisingly, that doesn't go exactly as planned. And there's a zealot pseudo-religious organization out there which has their own agenda, which features prominently in the later book. So it's very, very fun to write. Sort of written in a multi-point of view type setting where we have very close third point of view for characters, and they share like an entire chapter, and then you switch to another point of view for the next part of the story, sort of like the way Game of Thrones is written, or The Expanse, if you're familiar with either of those.
Yeah. So David, you and Chris started talking about ORP and the world surrounding that. I am a huge fan of that book. I think
the book that does not exist.
Yeah, me and like 5 other people that have read it, Chris.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, and it's in a shelf somewhere.
Yeah, and I have hounded Chris like every few months, like, dude, are you ever going to do anything with that book? David, what was the process like of taking Chris's kind of original vision and then pushing the boundaries out and expanding that world? Is it difficult taking someone else's original vision and expanding on that, or did Chris sell it so hard to you, you caught the vision?
Well, he sold it so hard, but that's part of the reason why I did the prequel.
Gotcha.
Was because so I sort of knew where he wanted it to end up. So basically, I just backed the truck up, 50 years or 35 years, whatever, and said, okay, how would we get from where we are right now to this thing that he wants in 2030 or whatever, or 2130 rather. And I said, so what, let's tell the story of how we got from here to there. So I was more sort of shooting at a future point and then writing the story that I wanted to write up to that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it also sort of made a technical sense for David to take on the first trilogy, because we're sort of genre spanning here. That's a term I just made up, I think.
I dig it.
It crosses multiple genres, right? And so he is a really good writer of like political military thriller stuff, as you know from Weapons of Mass Deception and Jihadi Apprentice. So it made sense for him to take on this nearer part of the near future storyline, which involves government intrigue and corporate espionage and things like that he had already proven that he was really good at writing. Plus, of course, sci-fi. There are sci-fi elements too, but it sort of starts off on a corporate military thriller runway and sort of takes off to sci-fi as the initial trilogy proceeds. So he was perfect choice for writing it.
David, because of your your thriller writing background and the military thrillers that you've written, pushing the timeline forward enough so that you're in this near future scenario, the setting, did that free you up as a thriller writer? Think as a thriller writer, taking the constraints of the present off and allowing you to use a little hand wavium and things like that. Does that make writing thriller stories easier, that you can pull on things that don't exist and you don't have to anchor them in what is presently possible?
Yeah. So one of the things that with my other collaboration with JR, these are very much sort of either now or very near future. So everything we do tends to be we try to keep it very authentic, and that can sometimes get in the way, right? Because no, I want to get from California to Korea in 2 hours. Well, you can't. Okay,
yeah.
That's not how it works. If anything, I had Chris dialing me back. He's like, "Oh no, you can't do that. It hasn't been invented yet." I'm like, "Why? I can invent it." He says, "No."
But not in 100 years. We won't be there yet. No, we got to dial it back some. Yeah, we had a lot of those conversations.
Yeah. I got plans for that. That hasn't been invented yet. You can't use that one. I'm like, oh, okay, fine. Anything else, Mom? Yeah.
So what has been invented? Where do we find technology in this near future? And I guess this would be a good place to talk about the catalyst for these stories. We talked about that there's a climate change crisis, but there's also been some jumps in technology. Where do we find technology, and why did you choose this scenario that kind of gets the pot boiling?
Sure. So the main character, or one of the main characters, is sort of an Elon Musk type guy who is always at the forefront of things, fabulously wealthy, and willing to turn that money into really, really big ideas. And in this case, it is a guy who wants to try to geo-engineer the Earth's atmosphere. In terms of what technology is available, space travel is something that is available commercially. It's not, available to the everyman. You do have air cars or personal air travel that is available to, sort of the wealthier third of the population. Gas-powered vehicles are still there. They're not really produced much, but ancient ones are still on the road, much like you find today. Much older cars. People are sort of making them work, right? I would say like one of the
kind of like it is in Cuba, where you've got this whole fleet of old things.
Right. Where much older cars are there, and people sort of make it work, but they're not producing 1950s humongous Chevrolets anymore. And I would say probably the biggest thing that features very prominently is the use of both data glasses and or in-eye retinal implants, which is a way, and a much more advanced internet, which sort of everybody's connected to, and we've really exploded the 24/7 news cycle till it's a sort of a nanosecond-like news cycle.
Gotcha. Chris, is this the original setting and the original circumstances that you envisioned in ORP, or I know you with David's prequel trilogy, you're dialing it back, but is this what you were originally thinking?
Well, yeah. I mean, for when I was writing ORP, which is like he said, like 30 years ahead of where this trilogy is in the timeline. I had in the back of my head that, these corporations came together and they sort of became, instead of the five families in The Godfather, you have the five factions, which are basically corporate conglomerates that have taken over different aspects of the planet. If you ever play like Civilization or something, there's always resource management, and there's construction, and then there's economic management. And so I sort of took five categories and said, okay, we're going to have five factions. Each faction is going to control a category, sort of like the five families split up the black market in The Godfather. And but in ORP, it was sort of already realized, right? That reality existed. So we had to, as he said, we had to back engineer it. And all I really knew about, the past was that the environment went to crap. The governments couldn't handle it. The corporations stepped up. And I really like playing with grays. I don't particularly like black and white. And so in ORP's time, the corporations are pretty jackbooted, with the population. You from cradle to the grave, you work for the corporation, and you can say, oh, well, that's a very totalitarian. That's very negative. Whatever you want to say. On the other hand, without those corporations having come together, humanity might have simply gone the way of the dodo, right? So there's the grayness of the corporations as they exist. So really all I had in mind was they came together, they saved humanity, and now they've sort of become this Godfather-like society. So David brilliantly, sort of back engineered that and said, okay, but before, because there are some pretty heavy plot points that you have to figure out, like how does the world, how does China and the United States and Russia and all of these very heavy powers, how do they come to surrender their autonomy? What must it take for that to happen? And so that's what you see sort of playing out in David's trilogy is going from the reality of a world in crisis 120 years from now to what eventually becomes this Godfather-like society in the trilogy that I've actually started writing, the second trilogy now. So, it's a long and winding road in a way, but it's really, really interesting the way things just evolve,
Well, what I find interesting is that it's just soon enough to us now to feel very anchored, very plausible, yet just future enough to ask those kinds of questions. What would happen if? What would cause a sovereign nation to step back and things like that? And that's a really interesting sandbox to play with, it seems like.
Yeah, I one of the examples that I gave to David very early on was about the French Revolution, and what really drove the French Revolution, it wasn't political philosophy, and it wasn't we want to get rid of the king and change this. We want to be Robespierre coming into power. All those things you read about in the history book. What it really was mothers of children who couldn't eat rioting for bread. That's what fueled the French Revolution, just as one example. And so I kept talking to him about, I want to see what's happening in the streets. I want to see because, a government can only shoot so many of its citizens before it descends into anarchy, right? And just imagine, the French tried that after the Revolution too. But anyway, imagine a world.
Well, you would know about the French Revolution.
I would, having that in my background. French, being French, that is.
Revolutionary.
Yeah, revolutionary. Yeah, the French Revolution was neither French nor a revolution. Discuss. Yes. But anyway, just imagine that, there are tsunamis happening where they shouldn't be happening, bomb cyclones happening where they shouldn't be happening. Deserts are now turning green. Green spaces are now turning deserts. Floods are pushing people. In the very first chapter of this first novel, The Lazarus Protocol, you get this history of a monster hurricane pushing Louisiana refugees into Mississippi, and imagine, gosh, we want to help, until that flood of people becomes overwhelming. And so imagine that all over the world, and the kind of stresses that puts on governments and their resources. And, you can kind of see how the dominoes would just keep falling and falling. And that's the story that David's telling.
And in chapter 1, the story leads off in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and in my neck of the woods. And I got the joke, Chris. I just want you to know.
Yeah, I told Hank the other day when I sent him the arc. He said, "Hey, you guys need to come see us. We just moved into our new house. Come to our neck of the woods." And I said, "Well, funny you should say that. Chapter 1 is your neck of the woods." And so finally, when he read the chapter, he's like, "I got it."
Yeah. So I took that as a personal shout out to me, and
that's we said, yes.
We just had the anniversary of the 13th year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, that brought massive devastation to Mississippi. I think it gets overlooked because New Orleans gets a lot of the attention there, and rightfully so. But there's massive devastation in Mississippi, and looking back at some of the videos and pictures just the other day, and kind of reliving some of that, when you start looking at these massive climate events like that, these are real world changers. Chris, you guys had a huge storm in Harvey last year, about the time that you and David started working on this. It's been just over a year for you guys with that storm. Was that kind of raw emotion, and the watching that stuff play out, I guess just south of where you are now, and I think your mom still lives in Houston.
Yeah.
Did that play into kind of some of what got this story started?
Sure. I mean, all of that is context. Irma and Harvey, and it was just crazy weather. And it was funny, as we were writing this, David and I both, check news feeds every day. And, I how when you buy a yellow car, and you start seeing yellow cars everywhere. So we're writing about this climate crisis in the near future. And I start seeing all these stories in the news feed popping up, Miami is sinking, or, the tundra is melting, or, whatever the headline was. And I would send it to David and say, see, we're on the right track here.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that difficult to extrapolate from where things are. I mean, a year ago, nobody would believe that 50 inches of rain could fall in Houston, right?
Exactly.
And then it happened. And, nobody would have believed that Katrina, or some of the things that happened that turned, part of the country into really, really desperate situations, would believe that would happen in a first world country, and yet it did, right? And so it's not that far to believe that you have, like in the very first chapter, you have a situation where states, put National Guard on their borders because they can't handle the influx of refugees from neighboring states. I mean, it's not when you just say it without context, you say, oh, well, that would never happen here. But then you look back at Katrina, or you look at Harvey, and you say, whoa, maybe it could. Maybe it could.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, pretty much every first world country is one grid failure away from being a third world country. So it's.
Thank you, sunshine.
It's a thinner veil than you think.
Oh man, let's talk about a little bit about this idea of a trilogy of trilogies, and multiple entry points to the world that you guys have created. David, what was your purpose for this initial trilogy, and how does it fit into the grand scheme of the trilogy of trilogies?
Yeah, so Chris's grand strategy in terms of he sort of had the overall architectural idea, and he was very focused on that center trilogy, and he had a very clear vision. I volunteered to do the sort of the prequel trilogy, and will carry some characters from the first trilogy into the second one, but it's intended to be a fresh storyline with a fresh set of characters, with maybe a few of the older ones carried through. And we really wanted to do it for a couple of reasons. One is that you want to have, if this is a 9-book series, telling everybody where you have to go back to book 1. I've done that before, and that's not really a great marketing tactic because you can only ever market book 1, right? So bringing people in with a fresh entry point, and since Chris is running point on that one, he's going to have a different voice for it, right? So, and they might like that more than they like mine. But I think if you get a person into a series and into a world, then they're going to want to go back and read everything in there. It also gives us the opportunity to do sort of spin-off novels. Whereas if you really have everyone who's read, there's a young Chinese woman in this, and everyone who's read the first couple books have said, what, man, I just love this main character. So Ming is probably going to get her own book at some point. So it allows us to do spin-off things, whether it's short stories or whether it's standalone novels, whatever. But still working within that same universe. It's kind of like, on a much, much smaller scale, it's not unlike what Michael Anderle's done with his Cthulhian universe, right? Where he's got, I don't know how many authors he has writing in that universe now, but it's
740.
Yeah. Oh, is it really?
No.
No, wait, no, 741.
Yeah. It's dozens probably, right?
Yeah, probably so.
And so they're all sort of writing in their own voice, but they're writing within a larger universe. And we're obviously just at the very, very beginning of that. But I think the idea of offering multiple entry points into the universe is a good plan, both for our sanity, because running point on a book or on a series of linked stories is just, it just takes a ton of effort. And so I can pass the baton off to him, and I can go work on my thrillers, because I have another one due at the beginning of next year. So I will need to be shifting focus there for a little while.
Well, let's talk about the logistics of collaborating on a series like this. David, you on the books that you do with JR and the thriller that you just mentioned, those books, they have a very specific voice that I pick up, David, in the voice of those books, but it's not the same voice as say the Dream Chronicles books that you do.
Right.
There's a difference. And I've read tons of Chris's stuff, and I know Chris's voice when I hear it, when I read it. When you are collaborating like that, well, first off, David, when you're collaborating on any series versus writing your own stuff, is that a conscious thing that David writes this way, but when I'm collaborating, I do this? Does that ever factor in anywhere?
I think it's more about the genre you're in. The Dream Guild Chronicles series was done, several years ago. So I think you've got the issue of maturation as well as being in a completely different genre. The thrillers have a very specific voice because it's a very I guess it's a no-nonsense voice. It's a very sparse voice, but it's very sort of action-oriented. You take a little more time, or at least I tend to take a little more time with science fiction. So the combination of sort of maturity of craft and the space that you're writing in, I think, lends to it. Collaboration-wise, you'll find parts of Chris certainly within the book because he was instrumental in it. It's definitely a blend, and working out how the boundaries of collaboration or something, especially if it's a long-term type thing like ours is, and like the one I have with JR. Those are that's contact sport. You just need to go and do it, and sometimes stuff works and sometimes stuff doesn't work, and then you reset and you try it again. There's just no other way to do it.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that Chris has strong opinions about things. I'm not saying that at all. Yeah.
No.
Which is easier than saying he's a control freak.
That's accurate.
We've had lots of teasing conversations about that. Chris, what's the collaboration process like for you? This is the first real meshed collaboration that you've done like this, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it definitely is. Well, like David said, we kind of had to figure out how we should do it. We wrote stories in Nick Webb's Legacy Fleet. We wrote novels in Nick Webb's Legacy Fleet about a year and a half ago. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah.
And he wrote the first book. We decided we were going to write a duology. I was going to say together. That's not accurate. We were going to write a book each. And mine was going to be the sequel to his. So he wrote a book and sent it to me raw, and I gave him feedback on it. I think maybe I helped him with the outline. I don't remember. And then I picked up characters from his first book and put to the front a particular character a heroine that I wanted to write about, and sort of put his character sort of in the background and wrote book 2. And he helped me with my outline, and he gave me first feedback on the book and all that kind of stuff too. So that's the way we did that. He wrote a book with a little bit of input from me. I wrote a book with a little bit of input from him. In this case, on Lazarus and the second book that will be coming out in October is called Cassandra's War. He wrote the first draft. Then I took it and sort of rewrote it and sort of built it out a little bit. I say rewrote, but added to it and sort of built it out. I fleshed out the colors and the sketches that he had made in a draft, and then he took it back and pared my stuff down a little bit in both of those books, and that was both an interesting and rewarding process, I think, for both of us. It was something that we wanted to try, and can we really write together? Not in the same room, but in the same paragraph, chapter. And I think we both decided the answer to that question is no. But not from a negative space. It's like his process. My process is very iterative at a micro level, and that is, I wrote 1,000 words today. I sit in front of the computer tomorrow. I rewrite those 1,000 words and add 500 to them. The next day I rewrite those 500 and add some more to them. Whereas he will sort of write a novel from chapter 1 to chapter 10 or chapter 30 and then go back and rewrite and then go back and rewrite. So he has a very macro approach to the rewrite process compared to my micro approach. And also our styles are different. I have become enamored of the Expanse novels and in the TV show too, but I particularly like the style in those novels. I've come to try and learn some lessons from the James S.A. Corey, pseudonym. And I think David's style is more sparse than that. So when I build out 250 words to 500, he might pare it back to 400 to be closer to what he likes it tighter than I do. So I think what we discovered. So with the third book, I outlined it, and then I actually went and visited. My wife and I went and visited. My wife Allison, and I went and visited David and his wife in Minnesota in July, and he and I sort of worked through the draft of the outline that I had sent up ahead of time, and now he's just writing it himself from start to finish. So I think what we discovered was the way we did those original Legacy Fleet novels is the way we work best. We have one captain and we have the first officer that gives some advice, but that one captain should control the narrative of the book that they're writing. So I think that's the lesson that we learned, and it took some doing to get to it,
Yeah. Now, the 3 trilogies that make up the trilogy of trilogies, you said they're going to be separated a bit so that you can finish one trilogy and then the next trilogy is its own entry point, so that like David was talking about, it's hard to market multiple books in a series because especially if they're all so closely tied together that the only thing you can ever market is book number 1. I think that makes logical sense to a lot of people. So how do you separate these so that you're looking at on a macro level one kind of overarching theme or overarching story, but giving them enough space that they become their own thing. So I guess my question is, how do you break them, and how much time and or space is between these series?
Well, between the first trilogy and the second trilogy, it's about 30 years. So as things wrap up at the end of the third book of the first trilogy, things are sort of set on a particular course, and then you pick up the storyline again, as David said, with some of the same characters and some new characters 30 years later. And so if you never ever heard of the first three books, you should be able to pick up the first book in the second trilogy and just go forward from there and be okay. Although you're missing all that nuance and backstory, but you could in theory do that.
Right now in science fiction in general is uber hot right now. Military sci-fi is doing gangbusters, but we're getting these really cool subgenres like the Expanse, like you're talking about, with letting us look at some real world problems from today in an off-world setting, and without going full Star Trek. In writing a series that you don't have faster than light travel and things are anchored closer to home and closer to reality now, what do you think that does for the potential for future storytelling?
David, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by the potential of future storytelling for our series. You mean?
Yeah, for your series. So I guess what like in Star Trek, if you push things far enough into the future,
you can do anything.
You can just dream stuff up constantly.
Right.
So,
right.
But being that you don't have that discovered yet, are you guys open to that possibility that technology will keep pushing forward? Or do you think that these people can get their act together enough to allow stuff like that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting part about this experiment for me is that all writing gives you a certain worldview, right? And even though this is sort of a corporate takeover type thing, and there's a lot of corporate intrigue, and there's a lot of very gray characters, I think ultimately it's a hopeful series. So going back to your previous question with Chris about how are these separated, they're actually separated by generations, right? So this is sort of the first trilogy is really the first generation of characters, and it's got a full story arc which carries across all three books. And then the second trilogy is really the next generation, so it'd be the offspring of many of the first trilogy characters. And I think with each generation you get new possibilities and new story options, both in terms of technology and in terms of what they're capable of, both sort of emotionally as well as where the world has gone from a technological standpoint.
Gotcha. Chris, where does the original ORP fit into all this?
In terms of the timeline, I could see it as sort of if we say novels 1 through 9, with the second trilogy starting with novel 4, it would sort of be a book 7, I think.
Okay.
Or 6.5 or whatever. It because of the age of the main character, who becomes a central point of view character in the second trilogy, and what happens to him in ORP, it necessarily has to come after the trilogy that I'm working on now.
Gotcha. Let's talk a little bit about publishing and the decisions that you're making in this series. Self-publishing, indie publishing is coming to a mature place. I like to think maybe more than the kind of Wild West attitude of several years ago, where people were writing and publishing and just throwing things out to the world, and a lot of people who had early success were telling the rest of us, write fast, publish fast, get tons of stuff out there, and a lot of people have a lot of regrets about some of those early, decisions. And
you promised me you'd never bring that up again.
Well, we're all looking at ourselves here. But there's I like to think that that a lot of us are really considering the long-term implications of what we're doing and treating this like this is not just another cash grab, because I think a lot of people kind of had that attitude early on. This is something I could get in, do this for a few years, make some money, and then go on to whatever the next thing was, because they weren't really writers. They were just entrepreneurs looking for the next thing. You guys have been working on this for a year, and staying quiet about it and making big plans and writing big books. What is fueling the idea behind how you're publishing this, and how many books do you guys have finished now? Kind of talk a little bit about the behind the scenes of what's going on here and your plans for publishing this.
Yeah, I'll let David kind of speak to that, but I just want to sort of preface it with he and I sort of butt heads over this, or have consistently. I just as a quick preview, what you're talking about, one of the things you're talking about is the Netflixation of indie authors, right? Where I got to have another book out next month. I got to have another book out next month. It's the binging thing, right? Where people want to click pre-order and get that book in their inbox the next month. Well, so David has a little bit more time on his hands than I do. He's retired. I'm still working a day job, so it's a little bit tougher for. I've done the raw math, and I can write a book about half as fast as he can. So what I wanted to do was try this experiment that we've seen other people be very successful with, like Nick Cole and Jason Anspach with their Galaxy's Edge series. They just pump those books out, and they're doing gangbusters, and they're well written, and yet they're still able to get them out quickly. And so I had to convince, and then I'll shut up. I had to convince David to sit on the first two books while he's getting a third one written before we put it out there. So I'll let him take over. Now he can tell his side of the story.
Which is what Jason and Nick did. They wrote some books in advance before they started publishing, and which probably helped their publishing as well. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah. So as we sit here today, books 1 and 2 are done completely, and pretty much ready to go. There's some minor cleanup work to do on the second book. The third book is on my computer. It's about 80% done-ish. It goes to my editor in another week and a half. So the plan has been to release the first trilogy in 30-day increments. So way back. Rewind the clock an entire year, we were thinking, well, we'll see if we can launch one in the spring, and then so my philosophy on publishing has been when the book is done and I'm happy with it, then it gets released. So Chris had to really talk me into let's completely write 3 books before we and so periodically, I would say yes, and then like a month would go by, and I call him up. Are you sure? Really? Because it's like done, and so we very affectionately had what we called Freak Out Friday, because it seemed like for a period of a month or two there, it seemed like every Friday. This was sort of in the spring time frame when the drafts were back and forth, and we were like, what the hell are we doing here? And it seemed like every Friday one of us would call the other one up and say, you know what, I don't think this is going to work, man. I just can't take it anymore. And the other one would have to calm the other guy down and say, look, it is. It's just, you just don't see the big picture. And you'd be like, okay, yeah. And it would always happen on a Friday for whatever reason. Yeah. It would always happen on a Friday. So, the joke got to be, hey, it's Freak Out Friday. And one of us is freaking out. I think that I don't hold as much stock in the every 30-day thing. I don't disagree that it's a thing. I just sort of am more along the lines of, I'm going to have a body of work. I want the body of work to be as good as I can make it. And then when it's ready to go out in the world, you just put it out in the world. Chris talked me into it. I agreed to it. I have gone back to him probably 100 times and said, hey, can't we just maybe this one? He says, no, we said, remember now. And I'm sure that he's right. I'll probably call him after this thing. Let's just put it out now. Let's just do it now, man. But part of the thing was when we started a year ago, we expected to be starting the launch process sooner, and part of that was the collaboration process, which we thought was going to make things faster. Actually, because of all the sort of backtracking we did, ended up being slower. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not that it's the process we initially set out with, because Chris has a background in editing. And the process we initially set out was I'll write a first draft, you can edit, and then we'll be done, right? Bing, bang, boom. So I neglected to factor in for him what my first drafts look like, because they don't look very good. And Chris has edited a bunch of my stuff, and he's read things, but he's always read either a very, very late draft or something that's already been through my copy editor. So I happily wrote a first draft and sent it to him, I don't know, like in December or something. And he calls me up. He's like, "What the hell is this, man? This is
yeah, Merry Christmas, and what the hell is this?
Yeah, this is terrible." I'm like, "Well, that's a first draft." He says, "Really? Oh my God!"
I don't think it was that bad.
I'm going to have to do a lot of work on this. I said, "Yeah, do some work." Well, so meanwhile, I said, "Look, while you're working on that, I'll go work on the second book." So I'm happily turning out another crappy draft on book 2. And then I moved on to the thriller book because I had to do edits for that. So I didn't even look at book 1 that he had gotten back to me until probably, I don't know, March or something. And I'm like, "Whoa, you made a lot of changes, didn't you?" I'm like, And now meanwhile, he's head down on book 2. So we've already perpetuated the situation we found ourselves in. So we had to do sort of like a hard reset and say, okay, what? I mean, we really need to rethink this. And meanwhile, and it was very clear to me, and I think Chris will agree with it, is that he didn't want to be editing my stuff. He wanted to be writing a book. Yeah. And I'm like, we need to get you writing, so we need to hire an editor and get you back to writing. And so he started on book 4 when I started on book 3. But we still had to get through, reworking books 1 and 2. So the net result of that was time, is that we ended up taking a lot more time on the front end than we had initially anticipated. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. I mean, collaborations are a contact sport. So you got to do something, and then when it doesn't work, you say, okay, that didn't work. What are we going to do next? Because, I mean, and I think that you don't really, and this was absolutely true with my other collaborators. Well, you don't really know how it's going to work out until you're about a year into the problem. So right about now, I think we're pretty comfortable with where things are. But if you talked to us 6 months ago, we'd be like, yeah, maybe. I don't know. And JR and I probably would have said the same thing until you figure out, because what you think you're good at going in and what you think you're bringing to the collaboration and what the collaboration needs and turns into are not always the same thing. Actually, at least in the 2 long-term collaborations I have, they are not the same thing. I mean, JR and I are now like in a total lockstep, and he's working on the 4th book in the series literally right now, and we have story meetings like every other week. But I mean, there it's a very, very different relationship. There, we talk through the story again and again and again, but he's essentially writing a very detailed outline and doing very detailed research that I take and I just write the book.
Well, that's
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to mention that it seems like every collaboration is different, because in talking with you and JR twice on the show, I have I think a pretty good understanding of the way you guys do it, and you are really the guy that puts the meat on the bones, and
exactly.
and whereas you and Chris are both authors. You're both writers that come to the story with your very with your own style and all of that. And that type of collaboration is in essence going to be different. I mean, it's just going to be. I also, in hearing Chris talk about how he writes that first draft in 1,000 words and then come back the next day and rewrite that and add 500 and then rewrite. So when Chris gets finished with a first draft, it's a pretty solid first draft.
Yeah.
And I'm like you, David. I see ideas and thoughts out ahead of me, and I'm writing toward those. I'm trying to catch those things, and at the end of that, it's a horrid mess. But I know what the story is, and then I can go through and I can clean that up, and then some people kind of think of that first draft as really a very, very detailed outline that just needs to be shaped up. So when you've got two people that write so differently, that it's going to be a tougher process, I bet. But some real magic happens when you get those two very different styles that merge into something really unique and cool.
Oh yeah, I mean, so collaborations are great. I mean, the benefits in my mind at least far outweigh, the pain and suffering you have to go through to get to where it's working well. So I mean, because there's any writer who's ever written by themselves will tell you, you get to a point in your story and you're like, I don't know what's going to happen. I've written myself into a corner. What do I do? And to be able to call someone up who has a detailed knowledge of what you're trying to do and bounce stuff off of them in real time is absolutely invaluable. I mean, you just don't get any better than that. And when you get to the point of actually launching a book, which is where we are now, I mean, two hands both, pulling in the same direction, to mix my metaphors here, really, really helps, because you both bring different stuff and you both know different people and you can both do different pieces of that launch process, because there's a long list of to-dos, and many hands make lighter work. But like for example, Chris is one of the founding members of Sci-Fi Bridge, so he knows a ton of authors and he knows a ton of influencers, which is absolutely invaluable that I don't know, right? So when you go through the actual mechanics of putting something out, it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. So what's the release schedule looking like? Book number 1, The Lazarus Protocol, is on sale today. You can get your copy of Lazarus Protocol, the first book in the first trilogy. It's out everywhere today. When are the other 2 books in this trilogy going to release? And then, Chris, do you have a set plan for when the second trilogy will launch? Will there be a break between those, or how are you guys handling that?
So the second book will be out, and I'm just going to say mid-October. We based on the first 3 chapters of Lazarus, Tantor Media bought the rights to the first 2 books for audiobooks. And
nice.
Lazarus as an audiobook, my first choice for narrators was David Drummond. I previewed, probably 10 Tantor audiobook narrators, and he is such a great voice, and because we have so many different perspectives, we have a young Chinese woman named Ming, we have an older American inventor, entrepreneur named Anthony, we have a young Army grunt named Remy, and we have an older Army colonel named William Graves. All 4 of those perspectives. I mean, if you can imagine different cultures, different genders, different generations. And anyway, I just thought David Drummond could do a great job with it. But anyway, my point of all that was, ostensibly we're going to release book 2 on October 4th, and we may still do that, but the first audiobook with the Lazarus audiobook should be coming out sometime in mid-October, so we may bump that a little bit. But second book in October, third book in November, and the sketch of the release schedule for the next trilogy, the one I'm working on now, we'll launch the first book in that first quarter of 2019, maybe as early as January.
Excellent, excellent. Well, guys, I'm super excited for you. The Lazarus Protocol is absolutely fantastic. I love it. I can't wait to see what you guys are doing. We're going to put links to all of it in the show notes and send everybody to pick up their copies of the Lazarus Protocol now. And I'll also update everyone when the new books are coming out. Where can people find more information about the new series and SynCorp Saga and everything you guys are doing?
So on my website, there is a page dedicated to the SynCorp Saga that has links to the books, mailing list sign up, and a little bit of information about us. So if you go to my website, it's David Bruns, D-A-V-I-D, Bruns, B-R-U-N-S, not Burns, Bruns, .com, and the SynCorp Saga is one of the tabs on the top of the page.
Excellent. And Chris, your website is chrispourteau.com?
Yeah, I better spell that. It's C-H-R-I-S. C-H-R-I-S. And then Pourteau is P-O-U-R-T-E-A-U.com. chrispourteau.com.
So complicated.
I know, dude. I know.
So French.
Story of my life.
Thanks for coming on, guys.
Hey, thanks for having us, man.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
They reverently slipped Jason's giant-size X-Men #1 from its mylar protector. Drinking in the sweet aroma of browning paper and three-color process that signals only the best and rarest and most wonderful of collectibles. On one page, Professor X raised his fingers to his temples and rallied his X-Men, his psychic commands radiating from his bald head like waves off hot asphalt. "I have psychic powers," Owen blurted. "I want Wolverine's claws." Jason was turning a page. "Snicked! Or, hey, get this. Lightsabers poking out the backs of my hands. Or even, no, I'm totally serious. I have psychic powers." "No, you don't." "I do." Jason laid the comic on the bedspread. He sighed. Owen could be such a spaz sometimes. "Okay," he said indulgently. "What number am I thinking of?" "Stop, it doesn't work that way. What I can do is called a psychic reading, off an object, like getting impressions. When the doorbell rings, if I put my hand on the knob, as soon as I do, I know who's there." "It's called looking through the peephole, moron." "Shut up! And when I touch the phone, I know who's calling." "I'm sure, Mr. Bullshit from Bullshit Mountain. Like my sister or my grandmother, I just know it's them." "There's no such thing as psychics." "Okay, you try." "Don't be stupid. Are you chicken?" "Fine." "Okay." He snatched up a brown paper bag, spotted with grease, and dumped a few stale French fries into the trash can. "I'll put an object in this bag, and you try to guess what it is. Turn your back." Jason did, and heard a rustling behind his head. "Okay, you can look now." Owen produced the bag. It was rounded with some object now. "Don't touch yet, just think. Try to imagine what's inside." "Your lunch?" Jason sneered, but he closed his eyes and tried to imagine. He could hear Owen's breathing. Jason's nose itched. His brain grew bored with nothing to look at, and fragments of images swam in and out of his imagination. "Strawberry," he blurted. Owen reached into the bag, producing a white bowl. Jason had eaten Frosted Flakes from it about 3 days ago. A few stuck to it, like little beige fish scales. "See? I lose." "No, look here." Owen pointed. A design went around the sides of the bowl. A long string of vines and painted fruit. With strawberries. "That's," Jason began, but didn't know how to end the sentence. "It's cool. See? What did I tell you? Do it again." Jason closed his eyes. An image like daisies and sun and yellow, he blurted after 3 seconds. "Oh my God, open your eyes!" Owen held a bright yellow highlighter pen. "I hadn't even put it in the bag." And so they went, for 30 minutes or more. A staple remover, a toy soldier, a sweat sock, a pencil. Jason never said precisely what was in the bag, but it was always close or related. He'd imagine a cockpit, and Owen would produce a game controller. He'd say plate, and the object would be a CD. He made right angles with his pointer fingers, shrugging, only to have Owen pull out Eliza's knitting needles. His friend became more and more enthusiastic, but Jason became a little scared. "You have a real gift," Owen said. "You're brilliant." Owen babbled for a long time about astral projection and ESP, how Jason was picking up signals from Owen's own psychic powers, which had obviously been doing the broadcasting. Owen left that night full of plans and experiments, vindicated in his beliefs. Jason sat on the bed after Owen left, thinking hard. He had no explanation for what he'd done, but he knew he hadn't faked it. He couldn't believe, but he couldn't deny either.